Right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this, the fourth meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I remind everyone present, please, to turn off their mobile phones and other electronic devices. Item 1 on the agenda, can we agree that we will take item 3 and all future items on the Business in Parliament conference in private? Yes. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Item 2 on the agenda is a continuation of our inquiry into underemployment in Scotland. And we have one panel of witnesses in front of us this morning. Introduce them from left to right. We have Gary Clark, who's Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Scottish Chambers of Commerce. Jackie Brierton, who's MD and Policy Director of Women's Enterprise Scotland. Jerry Higgins, Chief Executive of Community Enterprise in Scotland. And Kenny Richmond, Economics Director of Scottish Enterprise. Welcome to you all, and thank you for coming along. Now, before we get into questions, would any of you like to say anything by way of a brief introduction? Jackie?
Yes, just to say good morning, and I think, I hope I'm not the token woman here, but I'd like
Far from it.
I'd like to give evidence, particularly from a gender perspective this morning. And apologies that I wasn't able to put in a written submission before the meeting, but hopefully I could back anything up that's said today. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else want to say anything? It's not compulsory, we can go straight into questions. Fine. Okay, can I just say we've got quite a large panel this morning with 4 members on it, and it would be helpful if colleagues could direct their questions at particular members of the panel. If any of our witnesses wish to respond to a question that perhaps has been directed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, and I'll try and bring you in as best I can as time allows. I wonder if I could maybe just start off by asking a general question about the impact of underemployment. We've heard a lot over the past few weeks about the impact of underemployment on individuals who are employees, but what that means in terms of reduced working hours, the impact that has on benefits, for example, the impact that has on household incomes. What we haven't heard a lot yet is in relation to how underemployment might be a useful tool for employers in the current economic situation, where instead of laying people off, people are put on reduced hours, and therefore it could be a positive thing as an alternative to making people unemployed. And I wonder if anybody has got any examples of where that's happened, or where they would see, from an employer's perspective, underemployment being a useful tool. Kenny?
Yeah, from working with the number of companies that we support, we did find, especially at the beginning of the recession, that a small number of companies were looking at reducing work hours or taking shifts off, reducing overtime as they saw their demand decline. And we found that from many of those companies that working with their workforces on that, there was a give and take on both sides, and companies did find that useful at the beginning. And as we've seen a number of companies see their demand rise again, they were able to increase activity through that by using the workforce flexibly, increase hours rather than taking on necessarily more employees. So a number of companies did find that very useful, especially at the start of the recession.
And have you found, in terms of the companies that are account managed by Scottish Enterprise, have you found more reliance on agency working, on zero-hour contracts, on temporary workers? Has that been a phenomenon that's been developing?
For some companies, it tends to be mainly sector dependent. We've found that particularly in the food and drink sector, we've found a number of companies have looked at using contracting or contractors or recruitment agencies rather than taking on full-time staff. I think that's two things there. One is obviously seasonality for some companies in tourism sector as well as food and drink, but also where companies don't feel confident enough to take on full-time staff. If they see demand rise, but they're not sure how long that's going to be a sustainable increase in demand, some of them are looking at recruitment agencies or contractors. But it's, I'd say it's the minority rather than the majority.
Okay, so food and drink is one sector where that's happening. Are there other sectors you're aware of where you see this?
And some in tourism. Those are possibly the two sectors we're seeing where that's happening the most.
Okay. Anybody else? Jerry? Yeah.
We're seeing some of that in the manufacturing and distribution sector as well. Our perspective is different. It's that of maybe an agency that places people in businesses. And I guess I'm observing a tendency that businesses are coming to us more often. They are aware that they're having higher recruitment costs. They have greater churn and turnover, and that they're dealing with a workforce that in many cases has lower job satisfaction than would be ideal. But the flip side, it's about balance, and the flip side of this is that they are able to manage costs in line with demand and are more competitive. But there's a sense that this isn't sustainable in the long term, that the employers we deal with want to have workers who are properly and adequately engaged with good conditions, and but they need to make relevant adjustments for this period.
So it's really been seen as a temporary tool because of economic factors as opposed to a more permanent shift.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. Jackie?
I think overall, certainly from women's point of view, it's probably been more of a negative impact than a positive impact over the last 3 years, 4 years. Mainly because women's jobs have obviously been hit slightly more than men's jobs, given the decrease in the public sector. And we're also seeing more zero-hour contracts for the sort of jobs that a lot of women hold in the low-pay service sectors. So overall, although there's another side of it where we talk a lot to female-owned businesses who want to expand at the moment. So if they have the wherewithal to expand, certainly the labour market enables them to take people on in a more flexible way. But if you look at the statistics overall, the impact on women has actually been quite stark.
I think from our perspective, I mean, speaking to businesses across the course of the recession, shorter hour working and part-time working certainly was a measure that some businesses found appropriate in order to maintain the viability of the business and, importantly, to maintain the level of skills within the staff rather than let staff go. Many businesses were trying to ensure that they retained staff and skills. I'd say it's one of a number of options that different businesses used. I know of some businesses who, instead of cutting staff, went to across-the-board cuts in pay in order to maintain staff levels where they needed the staff level in order to fulfil contracts, etc. But undoubtedly, as the recession bit, we did see a large number of members moving towards more flexible working patterns. But I think at the same time, in the years leading up to that, there had been some measure of movement towards voluntary flexible working in order to fit in with, for example, family lives, etc. And that was a trend during the years of high employment. I think we have seen, obviously, over the past few years, an increase in perhaps involuntary part-time working in response partly to the recession. And given that our economy and output is still nowhere near the levels that it was back in 2007-8, that's a trend that has continued to some extent.
I'm quite interested in this question as to whether the rise in underemployment is permanent or cyclical, because we've heard quite a lot of evidence that even before the current economic downturn hit, we had rising levels of underemployment. So even when we had a strong economy, now Jerry Higgins, you said you felt it was temporary, the recent rise. I was interested in the submission we just had from CBI Scotland. They argue that it is a cyclical rather than a structural issue. So the expectation is when the economy improves that we'll see at levels of underemployment drop, if not disappear. Is that something you would agree with, Gary?
I think to some extent that is true, because I think there's many businesses out there who are currently working under capacity, and as they grow and reach capacity and look to expand, I think they'll be looking for either to increase the levels of staff or increase the participation of staff. So to that extent, I think, yes, some level of underemployment will improve. I think, though, that we did see during the times of high levels of employment before the recession, there was a substantial increase in the voluntary part-time working, for example, in order to maximise access to skills in the labour force, because skills are very difficult to access in those days. So I think there's a changing set of circumstances. I think there will be, to some extent, a cyclical pickup in terms of participation. But by the same token, I think society, is changing, and we will see continuing high levels of voluntary part-time work, for example. I think we do need to draw a distinction as well between sort of visible underemployment in terms of part-time working, etc., and the invisible in terms of skills not being utilised fully, or people working in jobs that don't match their particular skill set. I think that's a different challenge, and I think that's going to take a wee bit of solving.
Okay. Jackie?
I think there's, if you look at the cyclical aspects, again, if you look at the gendered aspect of this issue, you could argue that there's been underemployment amongst women in the workforce for a long period, because that shows up, that's illustrated in all sorts of things in the occupational segregation that still exists in the Scottish economy, the lack of women in senior positions in the economy in both public and private sectors. So there's a bigger issue there, which is beyond the current impact of the recession, which I think is being looked at in some aspects, but I think there's some really quite difficult things within the infrastructure that need to be looked at, and obviously the lack of childcare is one that's in the news at the moment, but it's a considerable problem. We had a round table of 12 businesswomen a few weeks ago, and out of those 12, 10 of them had identified childcare as the singular issue that was stopping them from expanding their business.
Okay.
I think some practices may well remain embedded in companies when they've been for the first time using 0 hours contracts and different forms of flexible working. The real test will come when there's a market demand, and in order to have the staffing to meet the demand, that you've got to change. Flexible contracts and part-time working may not be acceptable when the market changes. So that's the point where even in our own business we'll need to look at what do we need to do to get good quality staff in and retain them.
Thank you, and good morning, witnesses. Probably the question is for start with Jackie. On the gender aspect, we've heard a little bit about childcare and a bit about flexible working. I'm just wondering if there was a correlation with regard to maybe women coming back into the workforce after maternity leave, making a request for flexible working to enable better childcare. But at some point, when that childcare becomes less, perhaps when children go to school, or for whatever the reason they want to increase the hours, maybe employers are not able to do that due to the austerity programme. Do you think that's a reasonable suggestion? Or do you think initially when employers were being flexible and giving the flexible working pattern, that they were maybe forward planning to think that people would maybe increase their hours later on?
There's certainly some evidence of that, but a lot of the women we speak to still have issues. Once the children have gone to school, in some ways, some of the issues become even greater, simply because they have to be at the school at certain times of the day. We had a couple of women who couldn't even come to this round table simply because if they weren't at the school at a certain time, obviously there were issues. So I think it's a complex issue. We can see a lot of bigger employers making better facilities or enabling better flexible working, but there's still a lack of, if you want, imagination sometimes, or just that acceptance that by making simple changes, they could actually retain some of their most skilled and talented people.
The legislative programme, obviously around maternity leave and people coming back, do you think that that was a positive thing then for women, or do you think it's maybe having a slightly negative impact to some extent?
Well, all the evidence is that it's had a negative impact. You just need to look at some of the comments from some of the business organisations that their members are feeding back, that they probably wouldn't put it on record, but many are avoiding employing childbearing age women. And, you know, it's a tricky one too, because a lot of people wouldn't admit to that, but we know it happens, unfortunately.
So there's not enough forward planning then when people go on maternity leave for coming back into the workplace, and maybe having a flexible work pattern maybe over a number of years. Do you think that's...
I think a lot of companies just simply lack it's not just about saying, well, you can work part-time. It's about looking at more innovative ways of doing flexible working that would help a lot of people. If you look at some of the big companies, PwC actually I heard about recently, who have made great efforts to enable their female staff to come back after maternity leave in a way that suits them. And it might be very different from one person to another. But of course, we shouldn't fall into the trap that this is a women's issue solely, because obviously for a lot of men, childcare, the ability to work flexibly is just as important. And I think sometimes that's the problem. We put it into a silo.
But were you suggesting that's perhaps one of the prime reasons for women not getting into senior positions?
I think all the evidence points to that, to be honest. I think because women have a career break often at a critical time in their career pattern. And if you look at the other end, there's been a lot of discussion and dialogue about women on boards in the last year after the Davis report. And, there's a lot of focus on how do we get women onto boards. But actually, if you look at the pipeline of where women are in companies who might eventually get to that board level, women are missing in that vital period, often between their mid-30s and 40s when promotions are happening. So there are not enough women going into senior positions in order to be promoted to boards. So it's...
trend then is having a greater impact on women rather than men.
Well, I've certainly... I was interested to read some of the submissions which seemed to say that the problem was more for men than for women, but I would hold quite strongly that actually it's a bigger issue for women generally.
Anyone else like to?
Well, maybe bringing Gary. I mean, given what's been said about you represent a employers' organisation. Do you think there's evidence that employers are shunning younger women in the workforce because of concerns about maternity leave and the rights that brings?
I think it's difficult to point to evidence there. I think what is certainly true is that, looking at smaller businesses and larger businesses, they're differently equipped and able to enable them to respond to changes in personal circumstances and changes in employment patterns. I think in the early part of the last decade, we did begin to see pretty substantial efforts by employers of all sizes in order to attract and retain staff, because
sizes and sectors.
Across the sectors as well. I think some sectors it's more easy to introduce flexible working patterns than others. But certainly employers across the board were certainly trying very hard in order to attract the right staff with the right skills. They were looking beyond the traditional labour market and towards people who were not participating as much as they would like, or felt they didn't have the opportunity to participate, and trying to open up new ways of working, whether that was part-time working, whether that was home working, flexible hours, etc. And we did see a lot of that before the recession hit. I think since the recession has hit, I think employers have found it, if they're recruiting staff, I mean, they certainly haven't been underwhelmed by the level of response they're getting to recruitment. Quite the opposite.
Marco Biaggi wants to come in.
Yeah, just on the question of the gender divide, a hypothesis that I'd be interested to get Jackie Brereton's views on. The earlier statistics that we were presented with suggested that there was little gender gap in underemployment, or if there was anything actually once you controlled for all the factors, males were more likely to be underemployed. Those statistics looked at hours underemployment, so people that wanted to work more. Based on what you were saying, could it be the case, if all the data was investigated and everything was looked at, that while hours underemployment might be balanced, that the skills underemployment, people working at a level that isn't at the level of their qualifications, might be more of an issue for women given the difficulty of getting quality part-time jobs? Is that a fair understanding?
I think that's probably fair. Although I think it would be worth looking at the figures again in terms of hours underemployment, because the figures I've got here, which I think came from the STUC, show that the underemployment rate for the last year was 8.7% for males and 11.3% for females. So that would seem to undermine the argument that it is more of a... But of course, the part-time issue definitely skews it for females, and undoubtedly the lack of quality part-time jobs that are going to use women's skills and education are still lacking in the economy.
Okay, Rhoda Grant.
Could it be, I mean, we're seeing that unemployment rates aren't, in fact, if anything, they're going down, but people becoming economically inactive, I think is the new buzzword, is rising. Could it be that a lot of the women that are impacted are actually just stepping out of the workforce altogether? And that's maybe skewing the figures that we're looking at, because underemployment is maybe something that women are actually saying, well, actually, I'm not even entering into this, or people working part-time because of issues such as childcare are not answering the question that they could do more work because they're not available to work because of kind of the structural things that are in the employment market way beyond underemployment that affect them.
I think that's very true, and I think you can see, if you look at the self-employment figures, where there's been a large increase in self-employment, but when you actually look at the analysis, all the increase has been in part-time self-employment, and some of it's sort of less than 13 hours a week, and that's mostly women. So they're opting out of the broad employment market, maybe doing some activity, so they show up somewhere. But I think there's a huge number. It's the invisible underemployment with women that it's very difficult to measure. We don't have good data sources for that sort of thing. But anecdotally, we see it all the time. I run a project in Perthshire. It helps people to get into business, and 70% of my clients are women who have been economically inactive and often just come with a vague idea of trying to do something. But, you know, they've sometimes not been active for 5 or 6 years, not voluntarily, but because they simply can't see a way of getting a job. And I think, I haven't seen much analysis of rural versus urban, but I suspect that's an even bigger problem for women in rural areas than it is in urban areas. And that shows up with the large number of female self-employed proportionately in rural areas than urban areas. Often it's their only choice. So although we would say generally we promote self-employment as a positive thing and a potential ability to grow the economy, sometimes actually it can be quite a negative, particularly for women.
Can I just move on to the impact of underemployment on those affected? And kind of earlier on in the evidence session, people were saying that it's good to have underemployment, the workforce are ready to respond, etc., for an upturn in the market. But we heard evidence of the impact of underemployment on the individual was much the same as unemployment, in that, you know, those mental health issues, those health issues, there was issues of esteem and not to mention poverty in that mix. How long can someone be underemployed and remain able to respond to an upturn given that impact on them? How long can we do this before people really aren't going to be very productive at all?
Okay.
Well, I think the evidence would suggest that a situation like this isn't sustainable in terms of levels of underemployment. I think you're right. Over time, there may be issues around skills erosion. Obviously, there's issues around poverty for some people who are affected by underemployment. So where we are at the moment with a number of companies where they have reduced hours, etc., it's not a sustainable position. In terms of how long it's people can be underemployed before they start to be affected, I think that obviously that's personal circumstances. It will change person to person, but it's I would say it's not a sustainable situation where we are at the moment.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think whilst underemployment can be used as a means of sustaining a business and retaining staff, at the same time, the effects on the individuals. I mean, whether they, perhaps they're working at a level below their skill, in which case, they may not be very happy at all in employment, or they may be looking for additional jobs, second jobs, etc. And of course, that might have an impact on their ability to do both jobs. From that point of view, it's not a situation I think most businesses would want to be in for a significant length of time.
I think there's quite a lot of evidence, particularly for young people, that it can have a long-term scarring effect if they're either unemployed or underemployed for that first few years after they've left school, college, or university. And that's obviously a really worrying thing. I think we saw it in the 90s, where the impact of young people's unemployment lasted and affected their ability to both hold down a job and in terms of their health, etc., for at least 10 to 15 years after that initial experience. So that's something that's obviously that's currently affecting our economy.
Gary?
Yeah, I certainly support that. Our particular experience is that many jobs which would traditionally have been filled by young people, entry-level jobs in particular, are being filled by people who are overqualified for the jobs as an economic necessity. And while you can understand that from an employer's perspective, is creating a very significant knock-on effect in our ability to get young people into jobs.
Okay.
Given that those who are underemployed, and we had evidence last week that sometimes those that are underemployed are actually financially worse off than those on benefits, but are entrapped into this situation, what impact does that have on the economy as a whole?
It has a huge effect, because obviously it affects everything from spending within the economy to housing issues to the impact on children. I mean, it's enormous. We've seen some of the evidence we've seen shows that, for example, lone parents are probably the worst off due to current circumstances and inability to work within the current economy. And the long-term impact for them and their children will be something that we probably pay for in the future.
And obviously there's, for some, as well as the underemployment in terms of hours, there has been reductions in real wages, where wage rates have remained very stable over time, where we're seeing inflation higher. So for some, there'll be that they're being hit in two ways.
Chick Brody?
Thank you. Good morning. I wonder if I can come back to the point about young people and being not excluded, but being offered less jobs because more experienced people are being employed. And you can understand in the current environment why some employers would pursue that. Can I ask just your view of the cohesion of the youth employment programs and the processes with the kind of work that you're doing, for example, in CIS? I mean, one reads of Community Jobs Scotland are making a difference, but only for a small group of young people. Is there a black hole that, where there's no connection with the youth employment programs and what we're trying to do in terms of overcoming underemployment?
Sure, but Black Hole, there are a whole range of initiatives, some targeted at different groups. You've got schemes like the Commonwealth Graduates Fund and some of the intern programs trying to assist young graduates into jobs, as well as the community jobs, which has more of a focus on entry-level jobs. And I guess there's a commitment from every public sector agency that it will do what it can in relation to opportunities for young people. But from our perspective as a provider of services, we don't see that that's necessarily joined up.
How engaged are the local authorities in all of this whole employment activity?
Many struggle because they have limited opportunities for engagement of a significant volume of young people or people who present with support needs or disadvantages. And in some cases, systems that are designed not to take on people who have high support needs. So while there may be a commitment to try and do what one can, sometimes the processes actually get in the way. But I mean, local authorities in general are introducing initiatives to try and complement national and DWP initiatives to tackle this issue, and some are doing very well at it, and others probably have significant room for improvement.
Anybody else want to comment? Jackie?
I think one of the issues within youth employment is still that segregation that goes on, where young people actually get into apprenticeships, for example. We've still got segregation, which means that over 98% of engineering, plumbing, construction apprenticeships are still young men, and hairdressing, childcare, social care, etc., young women. And this has hardly changed in the last 20 years. So even when young people are getting an opportunity like an apprenticeship, they're still being siloed, if you like, into an area which, for example, for those young women going into those trades, which may end up in a job, which is great, but they will be lower income, lower skilled, and will have less prospects going forward than if they'd gone into. Now that's an education area that starts much earlier, but it is one of the impacts that we're seeing, that it restricts the opportunities available to young women coming through. One of the other interesting things is that we're seeing fewer young women going into self-employment or business ownership. It's still 4 times more young men than young women actually start a business by the time they're 25. And you know, it's difficult to see what the reason for that is, because we assume that our young men and young women are as confident as able, getting the same messages, and the entrepreneurship message has been reasonably strong through schools in the last 10 years. But we're still seeing that segregation, and I think that's another lost opportunity, particularly where young women are more than able to develop an idea. We were actually contacted by the Scottish Institute of Education of Enterprise recently, saying that they were, most of the people they attracted to their courses and their internships were young men. Could we help them to attract more young women? So that all has an impact going forward, and it has an impact longer term on the economy.
One of the frustrations, one lack of understanding on my part, is we have a fairly cohesive economic strategy in which sectors we want Scotland to be successful. There is a demand, we know, currently for engineers. And if you look at the demography of engineers, it's quite worrying that we're not filling the pipeline. We need something like 60,000. I know mobility and location are a problem, but I'm just wondering if you have any views as to how we can fill the pipeline that's been required in life sciences, in engineering, to a less extent in food and drink. I mean, where are we missing the trick?
Well, we're finding that a number of companies that are experiencing skills issues are looking at apprenticeship schemes, for example, or developing or working with local colleges to develop skills training courses to try and address that problem that you mentioned around the availability of skills, particularly in a number of sectors like engineering and life sciences. So there are good examples of companies who are taking action on that to try and address skills issues that they have.
But let me just, another question attached to that as an addendum to that. when we talk to, as we do, social enterprises and small businesses, there appears to be a lack of business support and a proliferation of funding mechanisms instead of getting a focus to support that type of activity. What again, are we missing a trick? Should we be changing something to encourage? I mean, the last session I talked about, and this won't happen overnight, but should we be looking to move people out of employment at an earlier age so that we backfill? And that's a cultural shift. But where is the silver bullet that says we can get this balance of employment right and mitigate the level of underemployment?
There is a silver bullet. I think it's a case of various actors having to work together. For example, for each of the kind of the key sectors that have been identified, there are skills groups that have been set up looking specifically at skills issues. So that could be one mechanism of where, at sector level at least, we can identify what the skills needs are and look at the appropriate mechanisms to try and address those.
Gary?
Yeah, I think if the answer was easy, we'd have had it by now. But certainly there's a combination of factors, and in terms of one of the things that Chambers of Commerce are doing at the moment in partnership with the Scottish Government is the graduate recruitment incentive in terms of trying to create new sustainable jobs for graduates in small, medium-sized businesses, having the advantage not just of getting graduates into jobs, but getting them into the right jobs and freeing up perhaps some of the jobs that they might otherwise have ended up in for people of an appropriate skill level for those jobs. I think in terms of matching up the supply side with the demand side, in terms of skills and employment, I think we have been working to try and find a solution to that for very many years now, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think there does need to be greater participation by business and by government in terms of working together to try and identify where the skills needs are going to be and how we fill those skill needs and respond to the demand that exists within business. But there's the responsibility on business there as well.
Yeah. With all due respect, Gary, we know, for example, that we're looking for something like 60,000 engineers over the next 8-10 years. In your opinion, why is that? Why are we not focusing to the level we should be on that?
I think we're probably not focusing on young people at an early enough age in terms of careers advice. I think it is difficult to provide careers advice without significant and extended input from the business community at an early age in our schools. And I read the other week that we're talking about getting careers advice at age 12. Well, maybe we should be starting a bit earlier. Kids are always talking about what they want to do when they grow up. Let's help them make better decisions.
Okay.
One last question. Is it not possible that we're actually going through a cultural shift now that the whole employment market is changing and that we're battling the old wars with old resources? Is it not fundamentally that the whole with the use of technology and further developments in technology and likely in technology, that maybe the whole workplace structure is changing and is changing quite rapidly, and that's why we have underemployment?
Jackie?
Yeah, I think you're probably right to an extent, and I don't think we've adapted what we offer to the changes. So even in terms of defining businesses, what sector businesses are in, a business offering something totally digitally, which might have been offered in a different way 5 years ago, finds it difficult to slot in to an area in terms of business support. I mean, Kenny might say more about that, but we see very small businesses that are actually turning over quite large amounts of money, literally from their kitchens, because they're using digital technology. And we see this particularly with young people who have got very innovative ideas of how you can build a business. But the way we support businesses is still very much stuck on the the old model of how you build a business. And that's very important in terms of employment, because there's lots of evidence to show that newer businesses, newer type businesses, will employ fewer people than before, but they'll have a big impact on the economy. They'll also work in a different way in terms of expanding their workforce. They may not employ people, but they may work in association with other companies or take on a more collaborative approach. And we've seen certainly with women-owned businesses that works. Women tend to collaborate more with other businesses rather than take on their own staff, for example. But then they're classified as very small businesses, so they might be having quite a big impact, but they're classified as a small business and therefore don't qualify for the business support as per the current criteria. So, but I think what we're seeing is a lot of more innovative ways of supporting businesses bubbling up from grassroots, if you like, from bottom up. So people are less reliant on the public sector for business support. They're looking to local community, to peer support, to local organisations that can provide support, perhaps in a more immediate way than some of the bigger agencies. But there's still a role for the bigger agencies because they can provide some of the, obviously the higher level support, and also the web-based support that's difficult for small organisations to do.
Okay, a couple of members want to come in with brief follow-ups before we move on. Start off with Dennis.
Yeah, just a brief supplementary onto Mr. Brodie's points with regard to the youth employment. Do you think there's a too much reliance on government initiatives rather than employers themselves taking on young people and then upskilling? You know, it's like a secondment in some respects. You're taking them in, upskilling, on-the-job training, or do you think employers are just looking for productivity from day one? So it's really two questions.
Gary?
Yeah, I think there's probably an element of truth in that. I mean, certainly employers do need to play their part, and employers, are usually, in our experience, quite happy to provide training to get people, into the jobs that they're doing. I think certainly looking at many of our members are SMEs. Many of them probably don't recruit enough young people at the moment. They're probably looking more towards people with experience, and given the nature of the current job market has already been mentioned, that can provide difficulties for young people. I think that employing a young person, I mean, it's probably very closely linked to the government schemes at the moment in terms of apprenticeships, in terms of what we're doing through the graduate recruitment incentive. And I think you're probably right. I mean, I think there probably is a greater need for employers to consider young people. But if we're going to do that, then what we do need to ensure is that we've got young people coming out of schools, colleges, universities with essentially job ready, to allow the employer then to train them up on the job that they're going to be doing. And that's probably something where the universities are achieving it reasonably well, the colleges are achieving it reasonably well, but schools probably need a bit more work.
Schools Academy, etc. would help fill that gap.
Possible.
Okay.
Okay, Marco?
2 points. One is referring to what you were saying about careers advice and at the age of 12. I look back on personal experience, make no apology for drawing on personal experience, that at the age of 13 I made subject choices. I didn't take standard grade biology, so as a result I could never become a doctor thereafter, and that was at the age of 13. Now, right now, I have no particular wish to be a doctor. It's not a great driving force in my life, but at the age of 13, I couldn't predict where I would be, what I would be wanting to do probably 6 months down the line, let alone 20 years. And I wonder, perhaps, to posit the idea and get your comment as to whether, instead of focusing on ever earlier selection, it might be better to have positive portrayals from a very early age, and to allow, if anything, a much later specialisation, so that people who by their, in their 20s can find it easier to get into specialist professions such as engineering by the point where they might have some idea with what they want to do with their life.
I think certainly the concept of lifelong learning has been become ingrained into the way we approach skills issues in Scotland, and that's a positive a positive change in the way we've done things here. I think in terms of careers advice, I think it is about allowing young people to make more informed decisions. And I think that is about ensuring that, for example, that, where possible, we try to ensure that our members are, getting into schools where possible and sharing their experiences and, well, this is what it means to be involved in doing this kind of work. This is what it means to do that. And that's the way we're going to, I think, help give young people more information to allow them to take better decisions suited to their own needs, because we can't tell people what to do, but we can give them the more information in terms of allowing them to make more informed decisions about something that's going to affect their future lives.
And there's been some great examples of where some sector-led initiatives have focused on that. For example, the chemical sector, they've done some work going around schools promoting what they do and trying to get across that chemicals isn't a dirty industry. It's can be quite an exciting industry. So there are some good examples of where industries have been doing that to promote themselves.
Someone who took standard grade chemistry, I'm very supportive of chemistry, but but I'm not a chemist, no. Many things I'm not. Looking at that, I mean, one of the issues is the underemployment by skills, and clearly there are people that have higher skills than they are using in their employment. But presumably there are also people that would like to have higher skills and would like to seek higher skilled employment, which I suppose is a form of underemployment as well. Do you think, in talking about these lifelong learning opportunities, that there is the same esteem in the job market and the same ultimate impact in terms of your employment if you are a returner or if you're using lifelong learning opportunities as if you had just gone in through the conventional, old-fashioned, traditional, in graduate professions, full-time undergraduate at age 18 route? Or do you think there is a difference there, and that people who go in through lifelong learning routes maybe have difficulty competing with those people?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think it's, there's pluses and minuses. I mean, I think someone with a greater degree of hinterland and variation in terms of their career history, may in some cases be more attractive to an employer, but I think it would very much depend on circumstances, and there's probably other factors that would have a bearing on that.
Thank you. Right, Margaret McDonough.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question on young people and their underemployment, and certainly Dennis has already asked the question that I was going to ask, but I can sort of widen out on that a little, because in your response on young people who are underemployed, you said that it seems that most of them are on government schemes. Did I pick you up correctly when you said that?
I said that the government schemes certainly are the most visible mechanisms of getting these people, young people, into work.
So employers, what are they doing to attract young people in? Because it seems that the high number of young people who are on fairly low qualifications, they're the ones who are the most underemployed. So is there a possibility that they are then being attracted into jobs, just they're there because that's the only thing they can get, and then employers are not training them up as they should unless there is a government scheme available?
Well, I think there are good examples of employers who have not historically looked towards young people being brought into to employment within their business and who are changing the way they're working. I think one example there would be Standard Life, who are, looked at themselves a few years ago and said, hey, wait a minute, we don't employ anyone under 20. And now they've got a scheme to get young people into employment here in Edinburgh. But I think for smaller businesses, it is often difficult to get them to consider a young person for the job, because the labour market, is so flexible these days, and they do have a great deal of choice. And as has already been mentioned, if you have a variety of candidates for the job, and you're a small business and you need that member of staff to be achieving results for your business from day one, you're probably going to be more likely to go for someone with a degree of experience, if that is an option. And I think that is more likely to be an option these days. So I think there is a difficulty there in facing young people in terms of competition in the workplace at the moment, or the labour market at the moment.
Young people are caught in that cycle where employers are saying we want experience, they can't get experience unless they get a job. So they're then forced into underemployment if they can get a job in the first place.
That's one of the reasons why we put forward the graduate recruitment incentive, which thankfully the Scottish Government have taken up, and we're getting young people into to jobs right now at graduate level in SMEs. I think that certainly focuses the employer's mind in that case by means of a grant to take on that young person. But also, we need to work with our members to ensure that they're looking at the positives that young people bring to their company in terms of, they may not have on paper the experience of another applicant, but they may have, fantastic social media skills that the other applicant might not have, but they might, not necessarily think is something that needs to be on their CV. Those are the kinds of things that young people can bring to the table, and we need to encourage our members to consider.
So if this young person does eventually get a job with an employer and they're underemployed, time-wise, do they get the same training as they would if they were in full employment?
I suppose it would depend upon circumstances, but if they're there for less time, then presumably they're not going to be learning as much on the job.
Yeah, which means that they're losing out. They're never going to get that full qualification opportunity. Does anyone else?
Jackie?
I think one of the fundamental issues is that the Scottish economy is largely made up of very, very small businesses. So the number of bigger businesses that can take both the risk and be able to invest in young people, there's not that many around proportionately. So for very small businesses, for somebody who's self-employed with maybe one other employee, or even just on their own, who would actually like to take on a young person, it's proportionately almost a burden, and the bureaucracy of employing anybody, whether it's a young person or not, often puts off self-employed people from taking on somebody, and that's just the bottom line. I've spoken to dozens of people who say we'd love to take on somebody, but we've just looked at what would be required in terms of all the legislation, the PAYE and health and safety, etc., and it's just not worth it. And that's something that I know that there's a UK government's desire to reduce red tape, but that's not really happened to help these very small businesses. So I think it's not a lack of desire. In many cases, a lot of people really genuinely would like to help young people, but it's just, in their minds, too difficult.
And as Gary mentioned, there's some great examples of companies who are looking specifically at apprenticeship schemes, and we're finding that particularly in engineering-related sectors, where companies where they can't find the people are proactively developing apprenticeship schemes and sometimes working together to put on joint apprenticeship schemes. So there is some good examples where that's working.
They wouldn't be underemployed, they would be in full-time apprenticeships.
Correct, yeah.
I think the time and resources for preparation of young people also needs to be considered. Many of the current national schemes don't allow for adequate preparation for people who've been I mean, what the employers need are work-ready young people with good attitude, and sometimes it can take quite a bit of assistance to prepare people for that first step with an employer. And I think where I've seen that working really well, local authorities have put in additional measures to allow agencies to work and support young people to mentor them through the first steps of employment, and where it's worked poorly, they get a minimum amount of assistance, and that leads to further problems because they're not able to get jobs.
Again, as has been mentioned, I think there are some really good examples out there of positive work that's being done by employers. I mean, another one on the engineering field is the Renewable Skills Academy at Steel Engineering in Renfrew, which is a fantastic scheme, and is basically, it's taking young people and equipping them not just potentially for a career in engineering, which they're pretty much guaranteeing them a job at the end of if they complete the course, but providing them with general employment and life skills during that period to enable them to have a better chance of getting into a job should they wish not to pursue a career in engineering. So there's good examples out there.
As time goes on, when there are more young people going through this crisis of not being able to find a job because they don't have the skills, or they can't get a job to get the experience, does that mean then we will then have more of these courses available to make them employment ready? And that, I know there are courses where, they make sure they get up, they know how to dress, what's expected of them when they actually get a job. So is that where we're heading? Where we have, because there's more people, young people just can't find work.
Perhaps to an extent that would depend on how the wider economic conditions play out. I think some of the evidence already being provided does suggest that a degree of underemployment is around the wider demand issues. So I guess if we see a continued period of weak demand and poor economic conditions, then I think obviously we'll still have these issues.
Okay. But what we don't want to be left with is when the upturn does arrive, we have a pool of people that don't have the talents to be able to put them into the workforce. So again, it comes back to the lifelong learning situation, and there needs to be opportunity available for these people to get the right skills, and that's probably going to be through the college sector to be able to fit into the workforce when the upturn happens.
Jenny?
There's a cost argument here that intervention now is going to be more effective. I don't want to be dealing with people in 3 years' time who've had 5 years, young people who've had 5 years of unemployment or really difficult employment situations with very low aspiration. Because the work that will take to have good options for that young person it's going to be really, really difficult.
Okay, Alison.
Two questions. Last week we heard from Women in Scotland's economy representative, and she gave us evidence that suggested that out of the 12 most popular modern apprenticeship frameworks, 8 of these were very severely gender segregated. There was an 85% dominance of one gender over the other, and it was just very much following the traditional model. There were lots of young men in engineering, construction, vehicle maintenance, and we're seeing lots of young women in health and social care and hairdressing, and obviously that does have an impact on your future economic security. And the Professor Ailsa Mackay, who wrote this, said that the Scottish Modern Apprenticeship Programme is receiving a great deal of public funding, but that if we continue to leave the apprenticeship system as it is untouched, instead of challenging gender segregation, it will actually be reinforcing it. And I know we're seeing campaigns like Close the Gap and Be What You Want that are trying to target children from an early age, but I just wonder what we could be doing now. Really, are there any policies that we could put in place now to try and do something about this at an earlier stage? Because this is a historical issue, but I'd hate us to be, in 20 years' time still saying this is a historical issue. What is it that we could take action on now? That's my first question.
Take that. Jackie?
Hoping one of the blokes would take that. Well, obviously I totally agree with, I'm familiar with Wise's work and Ailsa's work, and it's true, it's very, very segregated. And I think it comes back to all the things that we know needs to happen to change that. It starts at education level in terms of messaging, role models, encouraging young women and young men to think differently about careers, etc. I was at the University of Highlands Islands campus at Perth yesterday, and the head of curriculum for aeronautical engineering, who came from industry himself, was saying that he would love to see more young women coming into his faculty, because in his experience, the young women he has had have performed better than the young men. Now that's probably because they've had to do really well to even get there in the first place, but one of them actually won a competition up against all males. So it's nothing to do with ability, or it's to do with this sense that that's just not a woman's job or a girl's job. And to change that, we need to look at so many things in Scottish culture. We need to look at the way the media portrays men and women and what they do for a living. We need to obviously change the messages in education, but we also need to look at the opportunities within policy where we actually emphasise more readily that there are gendered aspects or gender differences within the Scottish economy that we need to try and do something about, because often it's invisible. We don't even gender disaggregate a lot of data that comes out around employment and the economy, for example. So sometimes it's even difficult to see what the true picture is. So I think it's just being aware that we are continually reinforcing that, sometimes without even realising it, and trying to think a bit more actively and not be nervous about looking at how things affect men and how things affect women, because it's interesting, even in the evidence for this session, there was very little said about the differences in experience of underemployment for men and for women, and yet it's significantly different when you look at the actual research and data that's available. So I think part of it is just being aware and making sure that all the organisations that can contribute to it are aware and helping.
I think there's also a role for employers. If we can get more employers to understand the benefits of having a diverse workforce, then you'll get more demand from employers for women engineers, for example, or women in sectors which currently aren't popular amongst women. So I think there's an employer's role as well.
And again, better information at a young age in order to allow people to make, career choices. And I think that is one way of trying to to tackle some of those stereotypes. And as has been mentioned, role models. If you look at chefs, 20, 30 years ago, Delia Smith. Now it's Gordon Ramsay, and it's I'm not sure if that's had much of an impact, or indeed a positive one. But it is about trying to get the message across that every job out there is for anyone.
I just wonder if some of it's come about because perhaps hairdressing and health and social care are easier to do on a part-time basis, and that's why we've just fallen into this almost. And I wonder if there's, if we need to be emphasising the economic impacts of these choices to young women at an earlier age, because perhaps they aren't even thinking like that when they're very young. My second question is, we've written evidence from the CBI, and they say that underemployment has a lower cost for individuals, the state and business than unemployment. And the 12th point that they make is being in work must, I'm not quite sure about this must, being in work must always be preferential to being out of work. So there's very much a view in this paper that underemployment is better than unemployment. And I think that's a view that was shared by the SCDI when they had them in. But I certainly think the STUC and Joseph Rowntree Foundation had a more nuanced position, and that one size would never fit all, and that we couldn't take it for granted, because for some people it's clearly not the case. Bernardo's pay to work report has highlighted the fact that in terms of childcare it could actually be costing you more to go to work than not. So I just wondered if it was your view that actually one size doesn't fit all, that we cannot simply say that underemployment is always better than unemployment for everyone.
You want to take that? Kenny?
So I'll just make a very quick observation. If you take that on a short-term basis, for certain individuals, being employed, although underemployed, is not economically advantageous to them in the short-term basis. Many of our clients who are in that position are doing it because they want their kids to see them in work, and they want that work ethic and aspiration to be strong, and are aware that economically this isn't a sensible thing to do, but it's what they wish to do. So I think that the statement must be better off, it needs to be certainly qualified.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? In your evidence, you highlight the fact that a lot of people who are underemployed could actually, they could fill the rest of their time, but it's very difficult because they're doing shift work, or, many of the businesses we engage with, employees have taken a reduction in hours to maintain employment. In many cases, the nature of that employment involves shift work, variable hours, or on-call work, and this makes it difficult to fill the other half. Do you think there's more we could do around that? Is it just?
I think from the circumstances we're seeing, it's if people are on 0 hours contracts or on flexible working, they know they have hours available that they would like to fill, and they simply can't do that. Some are trying, but it's difficult, and that leads to economic hardship in families because the family income is not what it could be. I'm taking it from the perspective of our clients with the employers that are engaging them, and I can see the employer perspective and I can see the client perspective, and right now I'm not seeing many options where it's straight shifts that somebody knows that they're going to be employed on a Monday and a Tuesday, and it's easier to fill the rest of the week with something, but that's the position that we're finding with our clients.
Sounds like flexibility is making them less flexible.
Particularly at the lower value end of the market. At the higher value end of the market, where people are on consultancy rates, they have far more options. There's less demand at the moment, but it's particularly stark for us where people are on national minimum wage or just above jobs, because it's difficult also to balance the flexibility and benefits. For instance, we've had a young man with autism have to turn down a job recently because it couldn't guarantee him the length of employment that would be needed to come off benefits, because going back on again could have put his housing situation at risk. So it can be difficult when you take this on an individual basis to say that people will be better off in work. I think it's not accurate.
I think economically, I think it is better to have underemployment than unemployment. But on an individual basis, as has been said for many reasons, it might not always be the choice for the individual based on their own set of circumstances. But I think we do need to ensure that businesses get the right support to succeed and to grow and to create proper full-time opportunities for as many people as want and need those opportunities.
I think from a woman's perspective that just can't be right, because you just need to look at the typical example of a relatively low-paid woman in a part-time job who's actually reliant on benefits topping up her income. It just needs a slight shift, and in fact it may be that post-March, post-April, that slight shift might actually push a lot of women from what might be classed as underemployment into unemployment, but they'll actually be better off because the cost of childcare against what they're actually bringing in is so marginal. And if child tax credits go down by the 10% that they're due to go down, that could be enough to tip a lot of women into the situation where it's actually not worth working. So I can't see how that can stand for, that statement can't really stand for a lot of these people.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time. A brief supplementary from Margaret McDougall and then Mike Mackenzie.
Just on childcare, and it is one of the barriers for getting women into work. I just wonder what employers are doing. I was fortunate quite a few years ago that I was able to get back to work because there was creche facilities in the place where I worked. Is that happening nowadays? Because I don't hear about it very much. Is it because of the costs and all the regulations around it? And I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, what employers could do to provide or assist with childcare costs, and or is it purely down to should there be more public subsidy to help with childcare costs?
You want to deal with that? Gary?
I think the cost of childcare is a major factor in decision making in terms of whether someone goes into the workplace or whether someone remains outside of the workplace.
You're talking from personal experience.
There is an element of that as well. But certainly, I mean, some employers, I mean, I know, Dell, for example, are very flexible in terms of home working, etc., for many of their employees in Scotland in terms of being able to deal with family issues. But for smaller employers, it is difficult to justify that kind of investment. And of course, any provision they're able to make in terms of contribution towards childcare have to be factored against staff costs and the cost of running the business and other overheads. So it is difficult, and I think from an SME perspective, we would always be looking for the state maybe to provide the right kind of tax breaks or subsidy where appropriate in order to help more people be able to access the opportunities that are there.
You've all said that, we want to attract more women into, different engineering, for example, different sectors. So isn't that one of the things that you should be looking at?
I think it was something that an awful lot of employers were looking at 10 years ago. But I think with the economic imperative at the moment, the pressures on margins and the wider labour market out there, it's probably gone off the top of the agenda because businesses just simply can't afford it at the moment in many cases. But I think it is, as the economy picks up, it's something that businesses will have to look more and more towards, as they did a decade ago.
Presumably it's also much easier for a large employer to do something than it would be for SMEs,
Absolutely.
which make up the bulk of the employment market.
Yeah.
I think the costs are prohibitive for smaller employers, and I think there's also the legislative burden of setting up. I know that there's such a huge number of regulations that have to be fulfilled. But just on childcare generally, obviously one of the advantages for people working for companies is that they can get childcare vouchers through their employers. But that's not something that's open to women who are running their own business or who are self-employed. And one of the things that we've been advocating is that at least, and I know this is a UK rather than a Scottish issue, but that at least childcare costs should be tax allowable deduction for self-employed people, not just women but people, because at the moment it's not, and that would make a huge difference.
Okay. Mike.
Thank you, convener. There's been a bit of discussion about gender stereotypes and cultural stereotypes that are inhibiting maybe women entering certain career paths. But I wonder if there's a more general problem of, and it's a kind of a cultural aspect to it, whereby young people are driven towards careers which they perceive to be exciting or glamorous or interesting. But where in fact the opportunities are actually really quite small, and I'm saying this because this was drawn to my attention by a headmaster I met fairly recently of a large secondary school, and he really felt that this was a significant problem in terms of directing youngsters to where genuine career opportunities lay. Do you agree this is a problem, and if so, what can we do about it?
I think it's undoubtedly a problem. And it's one that's been there for a number of years. You know, there's obvious examples. The forensic medicine is one. You know, people watch, you know, CSI and things like that on the TV and think, well, that'd be great. But then there's plenty of courses out there, but there aren't too many jobs at the end of it. It is a question from a point of view of the education provider. I mean, it is a question of identifying what is demand. And for us, I mean, demand is what business you know, is looking for at the end of the day from young people coming out of educational institutions, whether that's school, college or university. Whereas many colleges will look to the student for demand. So if enough students want to do forensic medicine, they'll do it, even although, you know, there aren't any jobs at the end of it. The demand should be led by, you know, business and public sector demand in terms of where the jobs actually are. But again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about ensuring that young people make the right decisions. I mean, if a young person knows that they have a, you know, 1 in 500 chance, say, of a job in forensic medicine, I think they'd be less likely to pick that as an option. So it's about ensuring that, again, as many of our members as possible are saying, look, this is the kind of work we're doing, this is the kind of work we'll be doing in 3 or 4 years' time, this is where we would like to be as a business, and these are the kind of people we need.
I'm very interested. I'd like to just hone in on the remark you made about the educational establishments who say, well, if there's enough demand for it, we'll run courses. And do you feel there's scope there for? Because, I mean, I'm struck by this again. You know, I'm talking to the young chap serving me behind the checkout. He's got a PhD, you know, a waiter in a coffee shop. You know, he's got a pretty good degree. But in talking to them, you know, you don't like to discourage youngsters, but in talking to them, the subjects they chose to study were ones where you think, not so sure that you're really going to easily find, you know, employment or better employment. Is there something kind of wrong here? Should the filter be applied at that level of further or higher education, where we, you know, we kind of stop the conveyor belt that's churning out this sort of student, because we know there are no opportunities? But on the other hand, we're getting signals from employers or industry sectors elsewhere, and that we're maybe not running sufficient courses there. Is the problem with the education sector?
I think it's difficult. There is an issue there, but at the end of the day, you know, I think it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to tell people what, you know, what they should be doing. They need to arrive at those decisions themselves, and then their demand drives and is aligned with the overall demand in terms of the labour.
So irrespective of whether or not there are jobs or not, if we think that, you know, loads of folk wish to be astronomers, you know, we should just churn out millions of astronomers, irrespective of their employment opportunities.
No, but I think the way to address that is to address proper careers advice and careers guidance to ensure that when people, young people are making a decision, that they're aware of the implications of that decision as far as possible.
With respect, I mean, part of what frustrates me about this and why I'm trying to kind of take us out of this, you know, that dialogue is, I've been hearing that same dialogue since I was at school, and that really wasn't yesterday. And, you know, we need to give kids better career advice, you know, and actually my perception is things are getting worse, not better.
I think that was a very interesting line of discussion. I remember when I did law many years ago, that the law faculties at the Scottish universities basically would collectively produce what they thought the law profession would require. And now we move way beyond that, where there's a huge multiple of law graduates being produced. And of course we're paying for this because it's all publicly funded. And I suppose the question is, to what extent can you command and control that element from a government angle, and would it work? Anyway, Jackie.
I saw a good example of maybe an approach that could work at Perth College yesterday, UHI campus, where the curriculum head for the media, drama, music bit of the college was talking about what they do. And it really, and you know, there's this sort of, oh, everybody's doing media studies, what's the point sort of thing, because they see it as the glamorous front end side.
Yeah.
But when students join that faculty, they immediately get confronted with all these other opportunities, such as learning about audio engineering or you know, presentation or production facilities, project management, all the things that in reality you need, all the skills you need to have to go into any career to do with the media. But actually, if you're an audio engineer, you've got multiple opportunities open to you. So I thought that was quite interesting, that they think they're going into study to be a TV presenter or whatever, but actually the opportunities then open to them could open up much wider. And if I presume that a lot of colleges do provide that kind of variety of options once the students are there. So it sounds like sort of getting people in by the back door, but it may be a way of making a wider choice more attractive and opening up new jobs that they hadn't even thought about.
We have an audio engineer here, but unfortunately we can't call on him to give evidence because he's too busy working. Anybody else want to pick that up?
I'm just going to briefly say that obviously a number of the sectors have been developing or have developed sector skills plans, which looks at the potential future needs in terms of numbers and types of skills. And having organisations like Scottish Funding Council involved in those should help provide that link to the supply side in terms of courses that are provided. So hopefully we should start to see that change.
Okay. Just one further question, Convener, and it's a slightly different tack, but I was interested to read in the written evidence, and I can't that we're presented with for this session. I can't remember exactly where, but that SSE are, you know, have a huge shortage of linesmen and cable layers, and given that we're going to be investing not millions but billions over the next decade or so upgrading the grid, that's a real problem. They perceive that as a huge problem, and it would appear that they're kind of looking to government to solve that problem, whereas in a previous era they would have taken on, you know, youngsters and trained them themselves. Is there a sense in which certain sectors or big private employers who, you know, are kind of handing this problem over to government, saying, or to the public sector, you need to solve this for us, rather than a previous practice whereby they solved their own skills and employment problems?
I think in many cases it's working in partnership with companies. There are many companies who will take things forward themselves and have the knowledge and ability to take things forward themselves. Other companies, especially some of the SMEs, may look to government for advice on how to do it and maybe some financial support. But I think where we're seeing companies that can do it themselves, great, they're doing it. Some other companies in times do need some support.
Okay, brief supplementary from Rhoda Grant.
Yes, I mean, just one thing, if we should be doing more to have employers, I know some colleges do this well, but surely employers should be linking to colleges and universities so that we're turning out the right people for the jobs, because we've got skill shortages, but also we've kind of heard earlier about underemployment from a skills sector, where we're churning out people who are never going to reach their full potential because the jobs, frankly, just aren't there. They're going to end up working, you know, at the till or whatever because their PhD is in the wrong thing altogether. Surely, if this is public money, we have a responsibility to make sure that it puts people along in the right direction and channels them where the skills are required.
Yeah, I think any investment that is made by the public sector in terms of you know, providing people with skills, I mean, it needs to provide them with the right skills where possible, and it means that as the economy picks up, we need to be supporting business to take on as many people as possible, and ensuring that the people who are available for them to take on either have the skills that business needs or are able to access those skills. And I think again the college sector's got a major role to play there in terms of skills provision and continuing education.
But universities as well surely should have a similar role.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. I've got a couple of points I want to cover we haven't touched on yet. But firstly, I think Dennis, you have another issue.
Very, very quickly. It's just perhaps the obstacles and solutions for the underemployment within the rural communities. You know, I mean, I understand that maybe some of the work is maybe seasonal, some of the work is maybe linked into tourism, and I think we know some of the obstacles that are there. But I just wonder if you could perhaps express some of the obstacles that you see within the underemployment within rural Scotland and maybe some of the solutions.
Jackie?
Certainly, there are numerous issues around continuous employment, obviously in rural areas, and seasonality is one of them. The kinds of industries that are still prevalent are another. What we're seeing quite a lot, certainly in this project I'm working on in Perthshire, is a real sense of people wanting to do things for themselves. So I think there is more potential to encourage people to be self-employed and to look at business opportunities in rural areas than is generally thought is there, because we tend to think of business startups coming out of urban more often than rural, but certainly in the project that's been going now for 5 years in Perthshire, Grobiz, we've seen more than 400 people coming forward with ideas for businesses, and more than 100 of those actually setting up and employing people. So, you know, that's an example of something that could be spread, rolled out to other areas, and just encourage that thought, because, you know, the tenet of the whole discussion around underemployment is about what employers can do and how we can change things. But at the end of the day, we have to accept that for many people, they will have to create their own jobs because the jobs won't exist otherwise. And although we have got we've got good policies around encouraging entrepreneurship and business startup in Scotland, sometimes I think we need to reconsider how we actually support those, particularly in rural areas, because sometimes you need to look at a different way of helping them to get through, and not just at the start, but a year down the line, 3 years down the line, to make sure that they can continue to grow.
Okay.
I think all of those points are extremely important. I think one thing I would say about rural areas is that quite often a couple of the problems are in accessing education and training and in accessing markets for businesses. I think in both of those cases, the development
Access
of
due to connectivity or transport.
Yeah. But in both of those cases, not only do we need to see, you know, where possible, improve transport links, but also improve digital connectivity, because that can provide solutions to geographical remoteness, both in terms of accessing those opportunities and accessing markets.
Okay, can I maybe just ask a couple of questions in closing about things we haven't touched on yet? The first is the question of productivity, which has come up in previous evidence sessions. Maybe I could direct this to Kenny Richmond. You know, first of all, what's been the impact of rising underemployment on business productivity? I'm thinking, you know, has there been an increase in competitiveness of Scottish business because they have a more flexible, albeit an underemployed workforce compared to what was there previously? You know, for example, where we have graduates filling non-graduate level jobs, does that actually help productivity, do you think?
What's quite interesting, some of the, obviously, the effects on productivity of underemployment depends on some of the measures that you look at. I've seen some evidence that suggests if you look at output per hour worked, then the productivity impact hasn't been as severe as output per worker. Yep. So that would suggest that where firms have looked at to reducing hours or underemployment as a response to the recession, that productivity for those companies hasn't really been affected, so it hasn't affected their competitiveness in the wider economy. So I think that's what we're seeing, that companies that are able to use the workforces flexibly haven't seen a major impact on their productivity or competitiveness levels.
I think businesses have been trying to manage their productivity and competitiveness over the past few years. I think the potential danger that underemployment might represent is in terms of the upturn and being able to maintain and increase productivity on the upturn of the economy.
Where we see underemployment, it's not really part of an employer's strategy for growth, it's part of a strategy for survival. In terms of where the economy is going to go, it's, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. And my final question, again, on a completely different topic. Where we have public support for business, for example, in the form of regional selective assistance, do you think that should be tied to measures of job quality and training? And thinking of an example, there's been in the press recently where Amazon coming into Dunfermline have got quite a large chunk of regional selective assistance. I think it was over £4 million, and yet there have been issues in the press about some of their employment practices. Do you think that's something, as we look at the development of policy going forward, do you think there should be a closer relationship between public support and workforce issues?
I think in an ideal world, we'd like to see all companies and all supports focused at high-value activities and high-value jobs, because those are the types of jobs that provide productive work for employees. But in the nature of the economy at the moment, there will be examples of companies who are looking for support to invest, and that will provide job opportunities across the range of skills and across the range of types of work. So I think support to help companies to grow, I think, is really important, and it will provide job opportunities across the spectrum.
Okay. Jackie?
I think from a gender perspective, there's a real issue around the way public funds are allocated, because they are the criteria for funding, as Kenny said, is about high value, high growth companies, jobs. Fewer women are running companies in those sectors, and therefore they are disproportionately not getting the help, if you like. So I know that certainly up to 2 years ago, fewer than 5% of the account managed businesses at Scottish Enterprise Help were actually female owned, so there's quite a big disconnect there. Where I agree that we need to obviously focus help on the businesses that are going to produce the biggest number of jobs. If we don't help the smaller businesses and other sectors, we're missing a big opportunity to create different types of employment.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answers. That's been a very helpful session. I appreciate we were on for some time, but we covered a lot of ground. So I'm grateful to you for your contribution and for your time. The next item on our agenda is in private, so I would suggest we have a short suspension.